Okay, welcome back. So let's switch back to the PowerPoint here, and let's pick up and let's tell the story of Isis and Osiris. So, as you guys might have seen, this is a weird and complicated one. It's confusing on some levels because there's multiple reasons. One is that very often the author will go on this weird tangent or tell things out of order or say multiple things are happening and leave you to decide which one of them is true. The other thing is that the author of this text is also a Greek guy, Plutarch, reporting what he heard about Egyptian mythology. And we'll get into the implications of that in a second here. But the thing that makes it confusing for us is that for everybody except Isis and Osiris, and maybe Horus, he replaces their names with what he thinks the Greek equivalents of those gods are. So, you know, at the beginning, he starts off saying Rhea and Cronus, not Nut and Geb. So it's quite weird. So we have to look between the lines and try and figure out what he's actually saying there. But I'll try and make it clear for you guys. Okay, so the myth as we have it. And there's some other stuff in the beginning. There's some talk about Nut and Geb and who they are. Some other excerpts of that we were in the reading. I'm going to focus on the Isis and Osiris part. So the Isis and Osiris part by Plutarch starts off with a recap of the origins of various different gods, the birth of Osiris and Isis and Seth, who he calls Typhon. And Typhon is, you may have heard of him if you've looked into Greek mythology before. Typhon or Typhon is a big monster guy who Zeus has to defeat. He's got like snakes for feet and hundreds of heads and maybe wings. He's pretty wild. So that's sort of, it maybe shows how rough fitting Greek names to Egyptian gods is, because this isn't really who Seth is, I think. But the closest equivalent is, you know, this sort of villainous character. So when he says Typhon, you can read Seth. Okay, so basically those three are all of one generation. Plutarch says that Isis and Osiris are in love, even though they're siblings. You know, as it goes in mythology, they don't have a whole lot of options. The world's still pretty new. But apparently they were in love with each other in the womb. So that's interesting. Okay, there's also a mention of an elder Horus here. This to me suggests duplication of myths and parataxis, which is that word for when you have sort of multiple stories put together into the same myth. We're going to see that a lot here. And I think one possible explanation of why there's an elder Horus and a younger Horus is because the Egyptians had this god Horus, and they had multiple stories about him that were completely contradictory. So one says that he's a sibling of Isis and Osiris. Another says that he's a child of Isis and Osiris. So yeah, they probably put those two different versions in the same story. But let's go with what they're saying here. The elder Horus is just a sibling here, and he's kind of a warrior too. Then we move on to Osiris teaching the Egyptian people how to grow grain. That seems pretty significant if he's associated with fertility. And then we get into the real meat of the story here, which is Osiris, he's king of the gods. Everybody agrees on that, except his evil brother, Set. And Set decides to trick him. So Isis guards Osiris most of the time and keeps him from harm. That's kind of interesting. She's powerful enough to guard him. And then Typhon tricks him into being murdered, basically. And here's how he does it. He brings a coffin to a party of the gods. And he says, hey, I made this coffin. Let's play a game of who can fit in the coffin. And you'd think that somebody would see that this is suspicious, but no. But he's measured it just right. It's the only one who fits it is Osiris. It's almost a Cinderella with coffins. And so he puts Osiris in the coffin, and then he locks the door, and then he fastens it shut with nails using molten lead. And then he takes the coffin and he throws it in the river and, you know, dumps it and hopes it'll just go all the way to the sea. So that's a very, that's an assassination as the gods do it. And so Osiris is killed. Maybe he's suffocated. And then the story goes in a variety of different directions. One version of the story, the one that we have in the book, is that the coffin actually wanders for a while, and Osiris is lost, and Isis goes looking for him, goes looking for the coffin in particular. And she gets some advice from some little children that Seth, had thrown the coffin into the sea. And so she figures it out and she goes to track it down. And then Plutarch just goes on a random tangent and says, oh, by the way, they were cheating on each other, except that Osiris thought that he was sleeping with Isis, but he was really sleeping with her sister. He just got mixed up. And that's where Anubis comes from. So he has to stop and randomly explain where Anubis comes from. But Anubis and Isis reconcile over the course of looking for Osiris's coffin. So that's pretty nice. They worked it out. And what Isis eventually finds is that the chest had landed at a place called Byblos and had gotten stuck in a tree. Like this tree had grown around it, grown around the coffin, and then this king thought this tree was really cool, and maybe the tree got some flourishing from Osiris's powers. And the king took this tree and he made it, still growing into the ground, into a pillar for the roof of his house. So now there's this random king and queen of Byblos who Isis is going to come across, and they have put her dead husband in their house, in the beams of their house. And then Isis does something weird and interesting, which is she just becomes a nanny for a while. She talks to the queen there, and she, pretends that she's just some random lady, some random stranger, and she offers herself as a guardian for their little baby. And so she's going to take care of their little baby, and she uses her finger to nurse the child, and she puts their child in a fire. But don't worry, it's a good thing, because she's actually burning away his mortality. So she's burning away his mortality, and then she turns into a bird and watches this baby in a fire until the queen gets back. As you can imagine, one day the queen found out that she was doing this and screamed and freaked out. And then the goddess revealed herself to be a goddess. And then it was only at that point that she asked, hey, can you please cut my husband's coffin out of this tree, please? And then she goes and wails on the coffin for a while. So that's a sort of weird thing that she does. But she says that she was trying to make the child immortal. And if the queen hadn't interrupted her, she would have actually succeeded. But now the child will be immortal, just like anybody else. So that's an interesting, Isis having some sort of power over immortality. What's that about? That's interesting. Let's hold on to that. Okay, but then she kind of gets back to the plot. She opens up the chest and she weeps for her dead husband. And there's some stuff that happens with the children of that king and queen that she was taking care of. One of them, maybe he falls into the sea. Another one of them becomes this this guy who invents music and dies young. So if you interact with the gods, you become important people. So there's another kind of tangent about that. And then Plutarch says, oh yeah, and Isis goes and visits her son Horus. He doesn't explain that Horus, where did Horus come from? Some people think, though, that when Isis was in the form of a swallow, or probably originally a sparrow in the original Egyptian version, flying around the dead tree, the tree with the dead husband, that somehow nourished her and she was able to get pregnant from that. Or maybe this is a son that was had before the killing Osiris incident, or maybe the son was born after killing Osiris. Yeah, there is a lot of different stuff that could be going on there. But yeah, so we're just supposed to conclude she has this son Horus, and she goes and visits him, and then while she's doing that, Set comes and he finds the coffin, and he's like, okay, well, I'm not going to let her get a hold of him. He tears Osiris's body up into 14 pieces, and he scatters them throughout the land like ancient relics. And Isis goes and tracks them down. Now, this myth kind of diverges into two different directions here as to what she does with the pieces. In one version, and Plutarch kind of tries to tell us both, in one version, she buries the pieces and they become holy sites. They really are relics, and sets up temples there for Osiris and tombs of Osiris. And I love that this is an explanation for why every small town in Egypt says that it has a tomb of Osiris, because they all do, because they're different tombs for different parts of his body. Now, in the other version of this, Isis actually puts the pieces back together and uses them to resurrect Osiris in some way. But there's actually one piece that she can't find, and that is his private parts, his genitals. So the gods just make Osiris a prosthetic golden phallus instead. And in some versions of the story, it's only then with the golden phallus that she becomes pregnant with Horus. But yeah, and in some versions it says that the phallus was eaten by a fish, and that's why Egyptians don't eat this fish. You can see etiologies all over the place. Plutarch just loves to explain things about Egyptians. And it's good to bear in mind that he's explaining them to non-Egyptians, so they may or may not be accurate. And then we have the story that Horus grows up and, quote, Osiris came to Horus from the other world. So in some versions of the story, Osiris is in the afterlife, but is training his son from the afterlife, like a really sort of drill sergeant ghost, you might say. And Osiris sort of helps raise Horus into this noble person who will avenge his father and mother for the evil done to them, and can do clever things like use tactics like using horses instead of lions, because horses are actually more useful for war. And eventually Horus defeats Seth and achieves this major victory. And then we end on this really weird note, which is that Horus takes over from Isis, that Horus takes the crown off of her head and puts it on his own. That he puts on Isis the horns of a cow. Why the horns of a cow? One reason might be that Isis is influenced by this older goddess, Hathor, who is kind of the original mother goddess of ancient Egypt, and Hathor's animal is very much the cow. She's sort of the goddess that you would go to in the Old Kingdom. In the New Kingdom, it would be much more that you would go to Isis, but Isis kind of absorbs some of Hathor's traits, including maybe these horns of the cow. But yeah, it's a little bit of a weird moment that Osiris takes over and takes the crown from Isis. But it seems to be saying that, Isis has these various kinds of powers. She resurrects Osiris in some way and takes care of Horus. But Horus is really the one who's in charge, who's in control. So you have this conflict between Isis being incredibly powerful enough to resurrect Osiris. And yet Horus is sort of the symbol of kingship, and most of the time, the pharaohs in Egypt are male rather than female. There are some exceptions, at least a handful, but mostly it's a male-dominated culture with some exceptions. And so we wonder, is it a less male-dominated culture than Greece or some of the other ones that we've looked at? Is it more sort of equal, or is it kind of somewhere in between? There's a lot here that suggests that Isis is more highly regarded and has more power than some of the goddesses that we saw in Greek mythology, not quite as subordinate, but that note of Horus taking over for her does kind of suggest otherwise. So it's interesting. And of course, with all this in mind, we see this really powerful pattern here, which is just as the flood brings back the fertility of the land, Isis brings back Osiris. So he dies, and he's kind of vulnerable, and she, in a way that she's not, but she has the power to bring him back to life. Just as the flood is what it's really all about, but the flood makes that sort of good soil that can grow crops, as Osiris grows crops here, possible. I think you should also note, now that we've seen this myth, that Osiris is very often depicted as a mummy, and that the rituals of the afterlife, which were especially popular in the New Kingdom, there's a book called The Book of the Dead, The Book of the Dead is basically a guide to how to get to the afterlife, and it involves a lot of worship of Osiris. And so here he is as a mummy and as the king of the afterlife, because he did die. So all these themes are coming together. Okay, that's basically the story. But I want to turn your attention to something weird here. So that whole thing with Isis randomly hanging out with this queen and deciding to make her baby immortal, that actually happens in Greek mythology as well. And this is a part we didn't look at from the story of Demeter and Persephone. So Demeter and Persephone, while Demeter is wailing for Persephone and looking for her, she does that same exact thing. She stops and she goes and she raises this baby. She makes herself into kind of a nanny. And then she starts putting this baby in a fire and trying to make him immortal. And then one day the queen comes in and sees what she's doing. And so we have this passage here from the hymn to Demeter. And Demeter says, "Ignorant humans, you can't tell the difference between good fortune and bad fortune. And you've made a big mistake. I would have made your little boy immortal. I would have given him eternal honor and immortality. But now there's no way for him to avoid death." And that's really interesting that this would appear in both stories. And that Demeter is said to have some power over death. Persephone dies, goes to the afterlife, and is resurrected. And Demeter is looking for her, but then she comes back and is resurrected. Osiris dies and goes to the afterlife, but is resurrected by the power of Isis. And both of these goddesses say that they have the power to make little princes immortal and to give that power kind of to human beings. And so both of these gods seem to be really associated with the tradition of making the afterlife better, or some way in which human beings can have eternal life. But we have to be really careful here because Plutarch is a Greek. So he is interpreting things in his own way. And it's very possible that that part of the myth wasn't in the original Egyptian version. And Plutarch added it because he feels that the closest equivalent to Isis is Demeter. On the other hand, it's possible that that was originally in the Egyptian myth. And the reason he thinks of Demeter is because there's so many similarities. Maybe the Egyptians had that story first and the Greeks had it afterward. It's really hard to know because Plutarch is really our best guide for this stuff, but he has a lot of flaws because he's telling the story to Greeks. He kind of thinks Greek culture is better. And so he's pretty flawed in that way. So we have to take everything he does with a grain of salt. But it's interesting that there are these connections at all. And another connection is that he sees Osiris as equivalent to Dionysus, which is pretty weird. Like, why Dionysus? Like, he doesn't really have anything to do with like wine or anything like that. But Dionysus is more than just wine. Remember that Dionysus has that idea of the afterlife, that he goes down into the afterlife in some stories. He died and was resurrected in some stories. His power over fertility is much more broad-reaching. He can make plants grow, not just wine. So you can kind of see how the parallels are put together. On the other hand, another author might say Osiris is more like Hades because he's, the king of the dead. Or maybe he's more like Zeus because he's kind of the leader out of the gods. There's a lot of different ways you could go with this. And this is a concept called syncretism, which is basically something that especially polytheistic mythologies can do, which is interpret other people's gods as their own. Syncretism means same belief in, I think it's Latin actually, in Latin. And so when you interpret other people's gods as your own, you can say, hey, your god Isis is just like our god Demeter. And we can basically say, we can just take all your myths and put our names into them. That's what the Romans did with the Greeks, to the point where it's hard to tell where the line was. With the Greeks, it was kind of a little bit of a takeover, especially the Greeks did literally take over Egypt at one point. So they had a lot of power. Okay, that's probably enough for this video. In the last video, hopefully last, I want to talk more about this syncretism and look at maybe sort of the influences on Isis in general, and if there are any parallels that we can bring out, or if we think it's more a question of being influenced by other cultures. All right. And we'll talk about that in the next video.